There are places on this earth where the normal rules seem to dissolve, where the line between the living world and something else, something older, something that doesn't have a name, becomes so thin you can almost touch it. The Cairngorms Plateau is one of these places. In July 1946, 6 men walked onto that plateau on what appeared to be an ordinary summer morning. They were experienced. They were prepared. They had done this before. But something on that mountain decided they would not come back down. What we know today, nearly 80 years later, is both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Their equipment was found scattered across miles of barren moorland. Their tents were erected in a manner that suggested hurried evacuation. Food rations lay untouched beside equipment that had been carefully maintained, maintenance suggesting they had not panicked or abandoned their supplies in chaos. Yet the men themselves had vanished without leaving a trace. No bodies, no bones weathered by decades of exposure, no final resting place that could ever be found. This is the story of what happened in the Cairngorms in 1946. It is a story about 6 men. It is a story about a mountain that seems to swallow people. And it is a story that still echoes through the Highlands today, whispered by locals who know the hills, feared by climbers who have heard the stories, and mourned by descendants who have never received the answers they deserve. Their names were Robert Thorne, a 34-year-old surveyor from Edinburgh, known for his meticulous planning and his encyclopedic knowledge of Scottish peaks. Beside him always was James Mackenzie, 31, a mathematics teacher whose students remembered him as someone who believed in the transformative power of wild places. Then there was David Sinclair, 28, a landscape painter who had come to the mountains seeking inspiration and finding instead something far more mysterious. Christopher Baird, 29, was a war veteran, a soldier who had survived the carnage of Europe only to face something that frightened him in a landscape that should have felt safe. Samuel Urquhart, 42, was the eldest of the group, a guide with nearly 20 years of mountaineering experience. And finally, there was young Thomas Reed, just 19 years old, a student whose mountaineering aspirations would be cut short before they had barely begun. These 6 men left Braemar on the morning of July 17, 1946. They told the youth hostel manager they would be back within 4 days. They never checked in. They never called. They never came home. To understand what happened that July, you have to understand the time in which it occurred. 1946 was a year of transition in Britain. The war had ended just a year before. Soldiers were returning to a country that was trying to remember how to be normal again. Rationing continued. Cities lay in rubble waiting to be rebuilt. But in the mountains of Scotland, there was a sense that something precious had been reclaimed. During the war, the mountains had been off-limits to civilians in many areas. Strategic considerations, military training exercises, and basic wartime restrictions meant that for 6 long years, the Highlands had belonged to the armed forces. But now, in 1946, with the war in Europe concluded and the weapons put down, at least for the moment, civilians were returning to the hills. They were coming back to reclaim something that felt sacred to them, the freedom to walk, to climb, to challenge themselves against the mountains they loved. The Cairngorms Plateau was one of the most challenging destinations in Scotland. At over 4,000 feet, the plateau itself was exposed, windswept, and notoriously difficult to navigate even in good weather. There were few landmarks. The terrain seemed to shift in different light. A path could vanish into mist in seconds. For experienced mountaineers, this was precisely what made it attractive. The challenge, the wildness, the sense of being at the edge of something vast and indifferent to human ambition. The summer of 1946 had been unusually pleasant in the Highlands. July began with clear skies and mild temperatures. This was the kind of weather that draws mountaineers to the hills, the kind of weather that makes a journey across an exposed plateau not just possible, but desirable. After years of wartime restriction, the mountains themselves seemed to be calling people back. Robert Thorne had been planning this expedition for months. He had coordinated with the 5 other climbers, each selected for their experience and their fitness. Thorne was a meticulous man. Some who knew him said he bordered on obsessive in his attention to detail. He maintained separate notebooks for different aspects of his mountaineering career. One notebook, which would later be recovered by authorities, contained lists of equipment checked and rechecked multiple times, weather predictions transcribed from meteorological offices, route alternatives mapped out with different colored inks, every contingency accounted for. In his journal, Thorne had written, "The plateau demands respect. It is not inherently dangerous, but it is unforgiving. One must approach it with humility and precision. A single moment of carelessness, a single instance of not checking and double-checking, can transform a pleasant journey into a catastrophe. I have seen men die in the mountains, and I have seen men who escape death only by the slimmest margin. The difference between those groups is often not skill, but vigilance. James Mackenzie, the mathematics teacher, had written to a colleague that he was looking forward to the expedition with the kind of excitement that suggests he felt it would be transformative. He had mentioned in correspondence that he wanted to understand the geometry of the landscape, how the plateaus were formed, how the valleys carved themselves into the earth. He spoke of the mountains with an almost spiritual reverence. One letter, which would later be recovered by his sister, ended with a line that would haunt everyone who read it. I feel as though I am seeking something in these hills that I have been missing in myself. Perhaps that is foolish, but I have always believed that the mountains have lessons to teach those willing to listen. David Sinclair, the landscape painter, had brought a sketchbook with him. The last entry in that sketchbook, dated July 17th, the day they disappeared, showed a remarkably detailed drawing of the Cairngorms plateau. The sketch was unfinished. The lines trailed off at the edges, as if the artist had been interrupted mid-composition. In the margins, barely legible, was a single word written in Sinclair's distinctive handwriting: wrong. Christopher Baird had served in the North African campaign and had seen combat in Italy. His war records indicated he had suffered what was then called shell shock and what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet he had recovered sufficiently to return to civilian life, to work as an engineer, to attempt to rebuild some sense of normalcy. His decision to join this mountaineering expedition suggested he believed that reconnection with the physical world might help complete his healing. A letter from Baird to Thorne, dated June 1946, indicated he was looking forward to the mountains as a kind of cleansing, a way to strip away the weight of the war years and feel truly alive again. Samuel Urquhart was known throughout the climbing community as a guide of exceptional skill and judgment. He had been climbing since his youth and had guided countless expeditions through the Scottish mountains. He had never experienced a significant accident. His reputation was one of absolute reliability. A colleague at the climbing club would later say of Urquhart, "Samuel was the kind of guide who made you feel safe in the most dangerous environments. There was something about his presence that calmed you, that made you believe that no matter how challenging the conditions, he would see you through safely." Thomas Reed, the youngest member of the party, had only recently begun his climbing career. At 19 years old, he was energetic and ambitious, desperate to prove himself among more experienced climbers. His family would later recall that he had been nervous about the expedition but determined not to show it. His mother said in an interview conducted years later, "Thomas was never the most naturally athletic boy, but he had the kind of determination that made people want to help him, to encourage him. When he told us he was going on this mountain expedition with men much more experienced than himself, I worried, but I could see how much it meant to him, how badly he wanted to prove himself. I should have insisted he not go." The summer of 1946 in the Cairngorms was about to become something that would be remembered for generations, not because of triumph, but because of tragedy, not because of achievement, but because of absolute erasure. On the morning of July 17, 1946, the 6 men left Braemar Youth Hostel with clear skies above them. The weather reports had predicted stable conditions through the week. The forecast showed no sign of the deterioration that would plague their journey. Robert Thorne had checked and double-checked the meteorological data. Everything pointed to an ideal window for their expedition. The hostel manager, a woman named Margaret Forsyth, would later provide detailed testimony about the departure. She remembered the men as being in good spirits, well-equipped, and methodical in their preparation. She recalled that Thorne had shown her his route plan and had promised to check in at the hostel in Aviemore by July 21st. "He was very precise," Forsyth said in her statement. "Very thorough. He showed me the map and explained exactly where they would be at different points along the route. I remember thinking that if anyone could successfully navigate that plateau, it would be this group. They carried modern equipment for the era, tents that were state-of-the-art, sleeping bags that represented the latest developments in mountaineering gear, food rations that were carefully calculated for 6 men over a 4-day journey. They had maps, they had compasses, they had climbing ropes and ice axes, though the summer conditions suggested they wouldn't need them. They had considered contingencies. They had prepared as thoroughly as any group could prepare. The route they planned was one of the classic Cairngorms traverses. They would cross the plateau from the south, heading north toward Ben Macdui, Scotland's second highest mountain. From there, they would descend into the Lairg Gru, the narrow pass between the mountains, and emerge into the valley below. It was a challenging journey, particularly the navigation across the plateau where landmarks were scarce, and the terrain could deceive even experienced mountaineers. But it was not considered extraordinarily dangerous, especially in summer conditions. For the first 2 days, the expedition proceeded without incident. Climbers who maintained records in various bothies and shelters throughout the Cairngorms noted that the group had passed through several checkpoints. On July 18th, a mountain shelter keeper named Angus MacLeod observed the 6 men ascending in good spirits. They had energy. They were moving at a steady pace. Their equipment appeared to be in order. The group seemed confident and well-organized. MacLeod recalled that Thorne had asked him detailed questions about weather patterns he had observed over the previous days, about any reports of unusual atmospheric conditions. Thorne appeared satisfied with MacLeod's responses, and the group continued their journey. By all accounts, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But something changed after that point. On July 19th, the weather began to shift. Not dramatically. The temperature dropped only slightly, and there was no rain. But a mist began to rise from the valleys below, creeping upward onto the plateau. This mist was not unprecedented in July, but it was unusual for it to arrive so suddenly and to persist so stubbornly. Within hours, the visibility on the plateau had dropped from several miles to just a few hundred meters. The sky that had been clear and bright became a uniform gray, oppressive and disorienting. This is when the stories begin to diverge, when fact and memory and speculation begin to blur together into something that is difficult to untangle. According to the search parties that would later comb the plateau, a shepherd named Donald MacLeod reported seeing figures moving through the mist on the afternoon of July 19th. He had been tending his flock on the lower slopes when he noticed 6 figures moving across the higher terrain. What struck MacLeod, in his statement to authorities, was not their presence, but their behavior. They were walking in a strange manner, he reported, not the way climbers usually walk. It was as if they were searching for something, or running from something. Their movements were erratic. They would move in one direction with purpose, then suddenly stop and seem confused, then move in a different direction. I watched them for perhaps 10 minutes, and the pattern repeated itself. It was strange to witness. It was like watching men who had lost their bearings completely. MacLeod noted that one figure, he could not determine which, appeared to be calling out to the others, though the mist carried his voice in distorted fragments that MacLeod could not comprehend. He also reported that the group seemed to be moving generally downward, away from the highest parts of the plateau, but that their movements seemed inefficient, zigzagging rather than following any logical descent route. This account would later become central to the theories that emerged around the disappearance. MacLeod was a man with decades of experience in the mountains. He was not given to flights of imagination or dramatic storytelling. His testimony carried weight because it came from someone who understood mountains, who could recognize when behavior was unusual, when something did not fit the normal patterns of mountaineering activity. When the group did not return to the hostel on July 21st as scheduled, alarm bells began to ring. The manager at Braemar Youth Hostel contacted the police immediately. The response was not instantaneous. Communication systems in 1946 were far less efficient than what we know today, and the rural Highlands were not considered a priority for rapid police deployment. But within 24 hours, initial search efforts were launched, coordinated through the regional police office in Aberdeen. These initial search efforts were constrained by the weather. The mist that had rolled onto the plateau on July 19th showed no signs of lifting. In fact, it seemed to be growing worse rather than better. Additional weather systems were moving into the region, bringing rain and wind that made the plateau even more treacherous than usual. By the time organized search teams were in position to begin a systematic search, the conditions had deteriorated to the point where searchers themselves faced significant danger. The searchers themselves faced the same disorientation and danger that the missing men must have faced. Visibility on the plateau in those conditions was measured in dozens of meters. The mist seemed to move with its own logic, sometimes parting to reveal landscape, sometimes closing in so completely that searchers could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Navigation became almost impossible, relying on compass readings and careful route finding through terrain that offered few landmarks to confirm position. What they found, however, would raise far more questions than it would answer. The search for the 6 missing hikers mobilized the larger community in ways that had not been seen since the war. Police teams arrived from Aberdeen and Inverness, Volunteers from the local climbing clubs joined the effort. Military personnel, still present in the Highlands in significant numbers, offered their resources and expertise. The organized mountain rescue operations that would later become formalized in Scotland had not yet been established, so the search was coordinated through police channels and local initiative, lending it an ad hoc quality that made it less efficient than it might have been. The police response was complicated by bureaucratic confusion and uncertainty. The case initially fell under the jurisdiction of multiple police departments, each unclear about which organization held ultimate authority. Radio communication between search teams was inconsistent. There was no established protocol for missing mountaineers. The assumption was that they had likely fallen victim to an accident, and that the priority should be recovering bodies rather than establishing what might have happened. For the first week, the search teams focused on the established routes and the most likely areas where 6 experienced mountaineers might seek shelter. But as the days passed without discovery of the men themselves, the search expanded. Teams began to cover the plateau methodically, moving across the terrain in grid patterns, calling out names that would only echo off stone and return unanswered. The weather continued to hamper efforts. On several days, conditions were so severe that search operations had to be suspended entirely. Team members were being exhausted by the physical demands of searching in such difficult terrain, and there were increasing concerns that the searchers themselves might begin to suffer accidents. It was on July 27th, 10 days after the men had gone missing, that the first pieces of equipment were found. A tent, partially dismantled, was discovered on the southern edge of the plateau, near Lochan Buide, a small mountain loch or lake. The tent's fabric was intact, but arranged oddly, not as if it had been torn down in a storm or destroyed by weather, but as if it had been carefully removed from its framework. The poles were stacked beside it in neat formation. The stakes that had anchored the tent to the earth had been methodically withdrawn. It was the kind of careful dismantling that suggested deliberate action, not panic. The searchers who discovered this first tent were puzzled. Why would experienced mountaineers dismantle their tent in such a methodical manner? Why would they leave it behind when a tent was essential equipment? The most obvious explanation was that the men had been forced to abandon the site for some urgent reason: injury, illness, disorientation, but had retained enough presence of mind to carefully pack their equipment rather than simply fleeing in panic. Over the next several days, more equipment emerged from the landscape, as if the mountain itself were regurgitating the possessions of its unwanted visitors. A sleeping bag, rolled and bound with rope, was found several kilometers from the tent. Food rations, in their original packages, lay scattered across a rocky outcropping. Not scattered as if scattered in a storm, but placed with spacing that suggested deliberate arrangement. A map, carefully preserved in a waterproof case, was discovered near a natural shelter. The map bore annotations in Robert Thorne's handwriting, notes about routes and elevations and landmarks that suggested careful navigation planning. More disturbing were the items that seemed to have no logical explanation for being where they were. Found: an ice axe, carefully positioned upright in a rock crevice, as if placed there for someone to retrieve later. A coil of rope arranged in a tight spiral on a flat rock. Climbing boots, arranged in a pair with socks neatly placed beside them, as if someone had simply stepped out of them and walked away. But what was most chilling was the arrangement of these items. They were not randomly scattered, as would be expected if the men had abandoned camp in panic or confusion. Instead, the equipment was distributed across the plateau in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, almost as if someone, or something, had been placing the items strategically across the landscape. The police investigator assigned to coordinate the search, a detective named James Sutherland, began to document the locations of each found item. He created a hand-drawn map, marking the coordinates of every piece of equipment, every clue. What emerged from this map, when the various locations were connected, was a pattern that Sutherland found deeply disturbing. The equipment was not distributed randomly. It seemed to follow a specific route across the plateau, almost as if it marked a trail. The most controversial discovery came on August 2nd, nearly a month after the disappearance. Searchers, moving through an area that had been combed multiple times already, found something that should not have been there: a carefully arranged circle of stones on the plateau, approximately 30 meters in diameter. At the center of this circle lay the remaining equipment: climbing ropes, ice axes, and several personal items, including notebooks and letters. The stones of the circle were not randomly selected. They appeared to have been chosen for their size and arranged with precision. There were 66 stones in total, each one approximately hand-sized, each one positioned with care. It was the kind of arrangement that would have required significant time and deliberate effort to construct. It was not something that could have been created in haste or in a state of panic. In the center, beside the equipment, was David Sinclair's sketchbook. When authorities opened it, they found that the final sketches had been continued after the July 17th entry that was previously known. These later sketches, dated and annotated over several days, showed increasingly abstract and disturbing imagery. Mountains were drawn with distorted proportions. The plateau was rendered as a maze with no exits, and in the margins, across multiple pages, a single phrase was repeated over and over in increasingly frantic handwriting. The mountain watches, the mountain knows, the mountain calls. The handwriting deteriorated noticeably as the entries progressed. The initial sketches and notations were neat and legible, but as the sequence continued, the letters became larger, more chaotic. Some words were crossed out and rewritten multiple times. Some entire sentences were rendered illegible by the intensity of the pen strokes used to write them. The final sketch in the book showed an abstract representation of the plateau. Human figures were drawn at the edges of the image, appearing to be pulled toward or fleeing from a central void that was rendered in such intense cross-hatching that the paper was nearly torn through by the force of the pen strokes. Among Sinclair's belongings was also a journal in which he had recorded the progression of the expedition. His entries began coherent and detailed. He described the climb, the weather, the camaraderie of the group. He noted which members of the party were energetic, which seemed more reserved. He recorded conversations about philosophy, about the meaning of wilderness, about how the mountains affected different people in different ways. But as the journal progressed through July 18th and into July 19th, something changed. The handwriting deteriorated. The entries became fragmented. Sinclair wrote about confusion, about landmarks appearing where they should not be, about the other men becoming strange in their behavior and conversation. His notations became increasingly metaphorical and less factual. July 18th evening. The plateau seems different today. I cannot articulate exactly how, but there is something about the light, the way the shadows fall, that makes the landscape seem less stable than before, like looking at a reflection in water just before the surface is disturbed. James keeps insisting we are on course, but I sense doubt in his voice. July 19th morning. The mist came suddenly. One moment we could see for miles. The next, we were inside it. Robert consulted the compass repeatedly. His face showed no concern, but I noticed his fingers trembling slightly as he held it. Is the compass reliable? How do you know? Christopher seemed particularly affected by the sudden change in visibility. He wanted to turn back, but Robert convinced him we were too far along to reverse course. July 19th evening. We have made camp, or tried to, but the mist it is not right. It seems to move with purpose. It closes in around us, opens up to show us different landscapes than we remember seeing. Samuel thinks I am imagining things, but I am a painter. I observe the world carefully. This is not normal. This is not right. The plateau around us seems to shift. Landmarks that should be permanent are not. We are navigating by compass alone now, trusting in a small brass instrument and Robert's steadfast belief in his calculations. But what if the compass itself is affected? What if there is something about this place that affects instruments as well as perception? His last entry, dated July 19th in the evening, consisted of a single sentence in handwriting so frantic that each letter seemed to be written with desperate urgency. We are not coming down the same mountain we climbed up. The years after 1946 were characterized by frustration and persistent mystery. No bodies were ever found. No final resting places that could provide the closure that the families desperately needed. The official investigation was essentially closed by late August 1946. The police concluded that the men had likely died in a mountaineering accident, probably during the fog on July 19th, and that their bodies had been carried into ravines or gullies where they would never be recovered. This was a tragic but logical conclusion given the evidence available. The mystery was deemed solved, even as it remained completely unsolved. Robert Thorne's widow, Margaret, spent the remainder of her life seeking answers. She corresponded with police, with mountaineering societies, with researchers who claimed to have insights into what might have happened. She traveled to the Cairngorms multiple times to speak with locals, with other mountaineers, with anyone who might have information. She maintained meticulous notes about all of these conversations, creating her own archive of the case. She lived to be 94 years old, and on her deathbed, her last request to her children was that they continue seeking the truth about what happened to her husband on the plateau. She reportedly said, "I do not believe Robert simply fell into a ravine. I do not believe the 6 of them simply had an accident. There was something else. I do not know what it was, but there was something else." James Mackenzie's sister, Eleanor, inherited his correspondence and his personal effects. She became something of an informal archivist of the case, collecting newspaper clippings, official reports, and witness statements. She spent decades researching the disappearance, corresponding with historians and mountaineering experts. She eventually donated these materials to the Scottish National Library, where they remain to this day, a meticulous record of bewilderment and loss. Eleanor lived until 1989, and in the final years of her life, she was interviewed by documentary makers and researchers. In these interviews, she spoke of her frustration with the official conclusion, with the way the case had been abandoned by authorities, with the sense that her brother and his companions had been forgotten by everyone except their families. The families were forced to confront an almost existential question. How do you mourn someone when you have not recovered their body? How do you conduct a funeral when there is no grave to mark? How do you accept death when there is no definitive proof of it? The church grappled with these questions as well. Eventually, memorial services were held, and the men were presumed dead, but the lack of physical remains meant that something essential in the mourning process could never be completed. The official position, adopted several years after the disappearance, was that the 6 men must be presumed dead. Certificates of death were issued, wills were settled, lives were moved forward by necessity, if not by genuine resolution. But each family carried the knowledge that somewhere on that plateau, in caves or gullies or ravines, the remains of their loved ones might still be present. This knowledge added a layer of pain to the normal grief of loss. It meant that the mourning was never fully closed, that there was always the possibility that answers might yet be found. But in the Highlands themselves, a different narrative began to emerge. The disappearance of the 6 men started to acquire the quality of legend. Stories were told in villages near the Cairngorms, in pubs in Braemar and Ballater, in bothies and shelters throughout the mountains. People began to speak of the plateau as though it were a place with agency, with intention, with a will of its own. The local story took on various forms. In some versions, the men had been warned before departure not to climb at that time. Omens had been observed. Birds had flown in unusual patterns. The weather, which had seemed promising, carried hidden signs of malevolence. In other versions, the plateau itself was described as a place of danger, a location where reality operated according to different rules, where compasses could not be trusted, where distance and direction became untrustworthy. Some climbers reported that subsequent expeditions across the plateau would occasionally encounter equipment from the 1946 party. A rope bearing an unexplainable date from July 1946 would turn up in a location that had been thoroughly searched years earlier. A note bearing Robert Thorne's distinctive handwriting would be found in a shelter where it logically could not have been placed without someone having carried it there, deliberately. A sleeping bag with the original manufacturer's tag from 1946 would be discovered in a crevice in excellent condition, as if it had just been placed there. These discoveries were often dismissed by authorities as misplaced items or misidentifications, but the accumulation of these reports created a persistent undercurrent of strangeness surrounding the case. Climbers began to speak of the 1946 disappearance as a kind of active mystery, not a historical tragedy that had been resolved, but rather an ongoing enigma that the mountain itself was participating in somehow. Local shepherds and mountain guides began to speak of strange phenomena associated with the plateau, mists that seemed to move with deliberate purpose, arriving on clear days and dissipating on days when the weather should have supported their continuation, weather patterns that defied meteorological explanation, storms that seemed to affect only specific areas of the plateau while leaving adjacent areas completely untouched. Sounds heard on the plateau at night, not the sounds of wind or animals, but sounds that resembled human voices calling out names. Multiple witnesses independently reported hearing voices calling Robert and James and Samuel in the darkness, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Climbers reported experiencing disorientation on the plateau even in clear weather and good visibility, as if there were something in the landscape itself that confused navigation and perception. Several climbers reported that compasses would behave erratically in specific locations, the needle spinning or pointing in inconsistent directions. One climber, who was interviewed as part of a 1960s research project, reported that while crossing the plateau on a clear day with perfect visibility and well-functioning instruments, she had experienced a sudden and overwhelming sense of dislocation, a moment where she could not remember where she was or how she had arrived there. This disorientation lasted perhaps only 30 seconds, but it was so profound that it caused her to sit down on the rock and simply wait for her sense of reality to stabilize. When it did, she was unable to explain what had happened, and she abandoned the expedition and descended from the plateau immediately. In the 1950s, a climbing expedition reported that they had found Robert Thorne's climbing boots, still laced and arranged, as if a person had simply stepped out of them and walked away. The boots were discovered in a location that would have required Thorne to remove them, walk a considerable distance barefoot through rough terrain, and then never return for them. The discovery raised immediate questions about the condition of the person who would have abandoned their boots in such a manner. Was he injured? Disoriented? Had he met with something that made the boots irrelevant to his continued survival? What made this discovery particularly strange was that the boots were in excellent condition. There was no deterioration consistent with exposure to nearly a decade of weather. They appeared almost new, as if they had been placed there only days or weeks before the discovery, not years earlier. The leather showed no weathering. The laces had not degraded. It was as if the boots had been preserved in some way, protected from the normal processes of decay and erosion. These discoveries were reported to the police, and files were created, and then, in many cases, filed away and forgotten. The official investigation into the disappearance had been closed years earlier. The case was presumed solved by simple explanation. The men must have become lost, must have experienced a catastrophic accident of some kind, their bodies likely lying in a location that had not been thoroughly searched, or that had been altered by time and the natural processes of decay and erosion. It was the logical conclusion, and it was almost certainly wrong. In the late 1980s, nearly 40 years after the disappearance, a researcher named Dr. Malcolm Stewart began examining the case with fresh perspective. Stewart was a psychologist and anthropologist with an interest in wilderness psychology, the ways in which the human mind responds to extreme isolation and challenging environments. He was not initially working on the 1946 case, but rather on a broader project examining historical accounts of mountaineering accidents in Scotland. Stewart became fascinated by the discrepancies in the official record. He began to compile the scattered reports, the recovered equipment, the journal entries. He conducted interviews with surviving family members and with people who had known the mountaineers. He accessed the papers that Eleanor Mackenzie had donated to the Scottish National Library. He obtained copies of police reports that had been archived and largely forgotten. And slowly, from this accumulated material, he began to construct a theory about what might have actually happened on that July day in 1946. Stewart's theory, which he published in a limited edition book in 1992, titled The Plateau Effect, Consciousness and the Cairngorms, was striking not because it provided a definitive answer, but because it raised more profound questions than it answered. Stewart suggested that the 6 men might not have been killed by any conventional mountaineering accident. Instead, he theorized that they might have become victims of what he called plateau disassociation, a psychological condition unique to navigating featureless, high-altitude terrain. According to Stewart's research, the human brain struggles to create mental maps in environments without visual landmarks. The plateau, particularly in mist or poor light, presents no clear references for the mind to orient itself against. The result can be a kind of cascade of perceptual distortions. Distance becomes untrustworthy. Time loses coherence. The mind, stripped of reliable sensory input, begins to generate its own references, phantom landmarks, illusory paths, sounds that don't have sources. Stewart theorized that the 5 men had likely fallen victim to this condition after the mist descended on July 19th. But Thorne, he suggested, had recognized what was happening. Thorne's notebooks, which Stewart was able to examine, contained references to this possibility. Thorne had actually written about the risk of plateau madness in his pre-expedition planning documents. He had been aware of the danger and had attempted to prepare the group for it. But in the end, Stewart argued, the preparation had been insufficient. Once the disassociation began, it would have cascaded through the group. Men who trusted each other would have begun to distrust each other's perceptions. A guide's judgment would have been questioned. A route that seemed clear to one person would seem incomprehensible to another. The group would have begun to fragment, mentally and then physically. What if, Stewart theorized, the careful dismantling of the camp and the deliberate arrangement of equipment across the plateau had not been the work of the men in a state of panic, but rather the work of men in a state of profound confusion? What if Robert Thorne, trying to create landmarks to help navigate the mist, had arranged the equipment in deliberate patterns, attempting to create visual anchors that his mind could hold on to? What if the circle of stones had been an attempt to create a sanctuary, a human-made structure that might restore a sense of order and control? Stewart's mathematical analysis of the stone circle was particularly intriguing. He argued that the 66 stones arranged in the circle corresponded to specific geometric ratios that would have been known to someone with mathematical knowledge. James Mackenzie, the mathematics teacher, might have been involved in this arrangement. The pattern suggested that someone had been thinking clearly enough to construct something based on mathematical principles, yet the overall context suggested confusion and disorientation. It was a contradictory pattern, evidence of both rationality and irrationality existing simultaneously. And what if, ultimately, the men had simply walked off the plateau, following phantom paths that seemed to lead somewhere but actually led nowhere? What if they had descended into ravines or gullies in the mist, injuries rendering them immobile, their calls for help absorbed by the landscape until they were no longer capable of making sound? Stewart's theory was neither provably correct nor definitively incorrect. It was, in essence, a framework for understanding a tragedy that might not have any clear explanation, and yet it resonated with people who knew the mountains. It explained the behavior described by the shepherd. It accounted for the carefully arranged equipment. It provided a narrative logic to events that had otherwise seemed inexplicable. More importantly, Stewart's work drew attention back to the case. His book was reviewed in academic journals and mountaineering publications. He was interviewed by documentarians and journalists. The disappearance, which had been effectively forgotten by the broader public, became visible again. What changed when Stewart published his work was not the facts of the case, those remained as mysterious as ever, but rather the way people spoke about the disappearance. The case shifted from being simply a tragedy, a mountaineering accident of unknown cause, into something more profound. It became an examination of the limits of human perception, the vulnerabilities of the human mind, the ways in which the natural world could challenge not just the body, but the very mechanisms by which the mind constructs reality. In 2001, on the 55th anniversary of the disappearance, the BBC aired a documentary about the case. The documentary featured interviews with the aging family members, reconstructions of the expedition, and expert commentary on mountaineering safety and wilderness psychology. It brought the case to a wider audience than it had reached in decades. Mountaineering schools began to reference the case when teaching about high-altitude psychology. The story of the 6 men became a cautionary tale, but also something more than that, a kind of parable about the way that wilderness, at its most extreme, could strip away the certainties that kept people anchored to ordinary consciousness. The documentary was titled The Cairngorms Shadow and was directed by an independent filmmaker named Sarah MacDonald. MacDonald conducted extensive research for the project, traveling to the plateau herself, interviewing current climbers and local residents, examining archival materials. She became convinced that there was something genuinely inexplicable about the case, something that standard explanations could not fully account for. She worked with Dr. Malcolm Stewart as a consultant, and together they constructed a narrative that presented both the facts of the case and the theories that had emerged from decades of speculation. The documentary was well received and won several awards for documentary filmmaking, but more importantly, it reignited public interest in the case. New theories emerged. Amateur researchers began to compile their own analyses. People who had known the victims came forward with additional stories and recollections that had not been part of the official record. The plateau itself began to acquire a reputation, both before and after the documentary. Climbers would speak of strange phenomena in the Cairngorms. Some reported that their compasses behaved erratically in certain locations, the same locations where equipment from the 1946 party had been found. Others spoke of the sensation of being watched or followed, of an almost overwhelming sense of dread that would descend upon them without obvious cause. A few climbers claimed to have experienced the same disorientation that Stewart had theorized might have affected the 6 men. A moment of perceptual confusion, where established landmarks seemed to shift, where direction became uncertain, where the mind seemed to rebel against the evidence of the senses. One notable case involved an experienced climber named David Henderson. In 2003, Henderson was crossing the plateau in perfect weather conditions with modern GPS equipment when he reported experiencing severe disorientation. Despite the clear weather and functioning technology, Henderson found himself convinced that he was moving in the opposite direction from where his instruments indicated. The psychological pressure to trust his internal sense of direction was so powerful that he stopped his expedition and descended from the plateau, abandoning his climb despite the excellent conditions. When interviewed later, Henderson said, "I was fighting my own mind. Every instrument told me I was going north, but every fiber of my being insisted I was going south. It was as if two realities were in conflict, and my consciousness was caught between them." In 2003, a climbing expedition equipped with modern GPS technology attempted to precisely map the locations where equipment from the 1946 party had been found. What they discovered was remarkable. The equipment was distributed across the plateau in a pattern that resembled a labyrinth when plotted on a map. The pattern was too deliberate, too geometric, to be random. It was as if the equipment marked a route through the landscape, a route that twisted back on itself, that led in apparently illogical directions, that seemed designed to confuse rather than to guide. When the pattern was analyzed by pattern recognition specialists, several of whom were brought in to examine it from a mathematical perspective, it was noted that the pattern resembled certain traditional labyrinth designs. Specifically, it resembled the famous labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral in France, the same cathedral where early Christian mystics had walked meditation paths designed to bring the walker into communion with divine mystery. Whether this similarity was coincidental, or whether it suggested something about the mental states of the men who had arranged the equipment, was a question that remained unanswered. The mathematical correspondence was uncanny. The ratio between the outer diameter of the 1946 stone circle and the specific geometry of the equipment placement corresponded closely to the proportions of the Chartres labyrinth, even accounting for differences in scale and terrain. Someone among the 6 men, possibly James Mackenzie with his mathematical background, possibly Robert Thorne with his surveying expertise, had apparently possessed knowledge of sacred geometry, and had unconsciously, or consciously, applied these principles to the arrangement of equipment on the plateau. Or perhaps this was simply a coincidence, a pattern that emerged from randomness, but appeared significant when examined through the lens of pattern-seeking human consciousness. By the early 2020s, more than 70 years after the disappearance, the case had acquired a complex cultural status. It was, simultaneously, a historical tragedy, a cautionary tale about mountaineering safety, a meditation on the psychological extremes of the human mind, and a legend. In villages near the Cairngorms, the story was told and retold, each retelling adding details or subtracting them, until it was difficult to distinguish fact from interpretation. New theories emerged periodically. A criminologist in Edinburgh suggested that the disappearance might have been orchestrated, that the men had deliberately faked their deaths and disappeared into a new life. This theory pointed to certain inconsistencies in the recovered equipment, to the curious fact that no bodies had ever been found despite decades of searching. However, this theory lacked any evidence to support it, and it was rejected by most serious researchers. What would have motivated 6 men to fake their deaths? Where would they have gone? How would they have maintained secrecy for 80 years? A paranormal researcher proposed that the plateau might be a location with unusual electromagnetic properties that could affect human perception and navigation. This theory, while more speculative than others, pointed to the reports of compass malfunctions and the instances of psychological disorientation experienced by climbers. The researcher suggested that certain areas of the plateau might have geological features that produced electromagnetic anomalies. However, no systematic study of electromagnetic properties on the plateau has ever been conducted, and this theory remains purely speculative. A mathematician analyzed David Sinclair's final sketches and suggested they contained encoded information about the fate of the 6 men, possibly coordinates, possibly a coded message meant to be deciphered by those who came later. The mathematician claimed to have identified patterns in the cross-hatching and in the distribution of text and image across the pages. However, others who examined the same sketches could not replicate this analysis, and most scholars concluded that the sketches were simply the confused artistic output of someone experiencing perceptual disorientation and psychological stress. The families, meanwhile, continued their quiet persistence. The descendants of Robert Thorne, Margaret's children and grandchildren, maintained a memorial at a small church in Edinburgh, gathering each July 17th to remember a man most of them had never known. Eleanor Mackenzie's descendants donated additional materials to the Scottish National Library, letters, photographs, personal effects, all of which have been preserved as part of the historical record. They spoke to researchers and documentarians, sharing family stories and recollections. They maintained a website dedicated to preserving the memory of the 6 men and their disappearance. In 2010, Thomas Reed's nephew, a man named Michael Reed, traveled to the Cairngorms and spent a week attempting to retrace the route that his uncle and the other 5 men would have taken. Reed kept a detailed journal of his experience. In it, he wrote about moments when he found himself disoriented, despite having modern technology and clear weather. He described an instance where, while standing on what his GPS clearly indicated was the plateau, he felt a powerful sense that he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere that the GPS could not map. He wrote, "I understand now, I think. I understand what might have happened to them. The plateau is not what it appears to be. There is something about it that challenges how we perceive reality. Whether it is geology or psychology or something else entirely, I cannot say. But I understand that my uncle and his companions were not simply lost. They were lost in a different sense, lost inside their own perceptions, lost in a landscape that seems to operate according to different rules than we expect. And the plateau itself? The Cairngorms Plateau remains one of Scotland's most beautiful and most challenging mountaineering destinations. It remains, too, one of its most mysterious. Climbers who venture onto it today are briefed on the history of the 1946 disappearance. They are told about the risks of plateau disassociation, about the importance of maintaining clear communication, about the need for constant verification of direction and location. But many of them, upon arriving on that high, barren landscape, understand intuitively why such warnings are necessary. They feel it, a vastness, an indifference, a sense that the landscape operates according to rules that human consciousness struggles to comprehend. Nearly 80 years after the disappearance, the fundamental question remains unchanged. What happened to those 6 men on that July day in 1946? Did they become victims of psychological disassociation, of confusion amplified by mist and isolation? Did they fall, victims of an accident made inevitable by disorientation? Did they somehow survive and disappear into a new life, a theory for which there is no supporting evidence, but which persists in certain corners of folklore? Or is there something about that place, something about those particular mountains, that contains a mystery that ordinary explanation cannot encompass? The Cairngorms Plateau keeps its secrets. The equipment has long since been recovered and archived. The journal entries and sketches have been studied by scholars and psychologists. The witness statements have been filed and refiled in police records. But the men themselves, Robert Thorne, James Mackenzie, David Sinclair, Christopher Baird, Samuel Urquhart, and Thomas Reed, remain absent. In the summer months, when the weather is clear and the plateau is accessible, new climbers arrive to attempt the classic Cairngorms traverses. Some of them, standing on that high, exposed landscape, will find themselves thinking about 6 men who walked into mist in July 1946 and were never seen again. They will feel the vastness of the place, the indifference of the landscape to human ambition and hope. They will understand, perhaps, that there are questions which the mountains will not answer, and mysteries which time will not resolve. The disappearance of the 6 hikers remains one of Scotland's great unsolved cases, but it is a case that perhaps was never intended to be solved. Not fully, not finally, not in a way that would satisfy the human need for closure and explanation. It remains what it has always been, a mystery of the Highlands, a story that the mountains continue to tell, and a reminder that there are places on this earth where the familiar rules of cause and effect, of certainty and explanation, seem somehow to be suspended. The plateau is waiting. The mist rolls in each year in the same seasons, and somewhere in the stone and silence of the Cairngorms, the question persists. What happened to those 6 men? And in the asking of that question, something vast and patient and utterly indifferent seems to smile. 79 years have passed. The mystery endures, and the mountain keeps watching.